39. It says this: "You have heard the law that says the punishment must match the injury. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But I say, do not resist an evil person. If someone slaps you on the right cheek, offer the other cheek also." It's good to have you here this morning. It's good to see familiar faces as well as some of the new ones. And this morning, we come to this passage in the Sermon on the Mount. And this section is really going to be addressing this idea of revenge. Or conversely, or the other aspect of that is forgiveness. Revenge, you see, is sweet. Revenge is satisfying. Volume down on that a little. There's something satisfying knowing that the other person gets what is coming to them, right? Because revenge is so satisfying. Actually, we love getting even. We love settling the score. Getting even sometimes is not enough. We have to get even and then some. Because we want to teach the person a lesson. You mess with me, you hurt me, I'm going to hurt you back. I'm going to make sure that you never mess with me again. That's kind of the logic that we kind of process through. When someone hurts us, our natural response and our tendency is payback. We want them to hurt like we hurt. We reason because they hurt us, we owe them some hurt in return. Because revenge is sweet. Revenge is satisfying. You know, this is a thought that I think most of us, you and I have. If someone hurts us, we want to hurt the other person back. To the degree that they hurt us, that's what we want to pay back. And this is the thought process I think that most of us are accustomed to. However, in this passage today, Jesus speaks a little bit differently. He teaches a little bit differently about this idea of revenge. The Sermon on the Mount is a series of teachings that Jesus expects his disciples, how he expects his disciples to live by. We come to the passage where Jesus is going to teach on this idea or the topic of revenge. The key point today, and these words that you guys have all heard before, is turn the other cheek, or in this passage in the New Living Translation, it says, offer the other cheek also. This is something that's very difficult to do. Just the way that Jesus starts off verse 38, you have heard the laws. It says the punishment must match the injury, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Just the way that he starts off by quoting that passage, we have to ask the question, is there a biblical precedent for retaliation or revenge? Is there a biblical basis for this? Because we have to ask the question, where does this idea of an eye for an eye come from? Because Jesus is making reference to that in verse 38. Where is this coming from? And this concept of the eye for an eye actually is part of the Mosaic law of the Old Testament. It was actually a part of the Israelites' their judicial system. The principle is that the punishment must fit the crime. And there should be just penalty for evil actions. What basically that means is this. It's actually, you find this in Exodus 21, verse 23 through 25. It says, if there is serious injury, you are to take life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. That's Exodus 21, verse 23, 24, 25. So is there a biblical basis for revenge and retaliation? If you look at this passage just by itself, the answer is, I think so, or yes. But if you look at the context of what God has presented to the Israelites before this passage, chapter 18 of Exodus, there is a boundary in which this is supposed to take place. And that is a part of the judicial system. What that means is within the court system. We have that system today in America, right? You do something, your crime that you commit, well, there's a penalty for that. The more serious the crime, the more harsh the penalty. Okay? So justice should be equitable. It should be equivalent. If you hurt somebody, it shouldn't be put to death. So that's kind of the balance and checks and balance that God is establishing here with the Israelites. So in Exodus 21, we see that passage where it says, if there is serious injury, then by all means, life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, etc. We have no indication, however, that the law of an eye for an eye that resulted in anyone actually being maimed or hands cut off, eyes purged, feet cut off, etc. Most crimes were repaid with payments in goods, actually. So if you did cause someone to lose a hand, most likely you would be required to pay back that person in monetary ways, through money, basically. Because the person would no longer be able to work and be able to take care of himself. We don't see cases in the Old Testament where this was literally taken word for word, an eye for an eye. It was intended to be a guiding principle for lawgivers and for judges. Once again, it's part of this judicial system that God established. Our natural inclination is to retaliate a wrong with a wrong, right? That is done to us. And in Jesus' day, that is exactly what seems to be happening. In the New Testament, by the time Jesus gets onto the scene, it seems like the Pharisees were teaching, you can apply this to personal situations. Meaning, if somebody insults you, you can insult them back. If someone hits you, you can hit them back. If somebody does wrong to you, you have the right to retaliate. That seems to be what the Pharisees were teaching. They taught that seeking personal revenge was acceptable. Because they misapplied, I think, Exodus 21. So to that, Jesus comes onto the scene and says, hey, you have heard it said, an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, he's going to change the narrative a little bit. Because the Pharisees said, hey, if someone punches you, you can punch them back. If someone insulted you, you can insult them back. Retaliation was acceptable. So Jesus, what he does here is he identifies this flawed interpretation. And as he identifies that, he's going to call his followers to abide in a certain way that honors him. And that's basically what the Sermon on the Mount, that's the context of the whole Sermon on the Mount. How he wants his disciples to live and conduct their daily life. Is there a biblical basis for retaliation? Yes, but within the judicial system. Jesus' disciples are encouraged to not retaliate. Although you have a case where you can, he says, do not retaliate. And that's what basically verse 38 and 39 is talking about. What Jesus is doing here is to counter the common teaching of personal retaliation. You have heard the law that says punishment must fit or match the injury. An eye for an eye, a tooth for tooth, and so on. Verse 39, he says, I tell you, but I say, if someone slaps you on the right cheek, offer the other cheek also. Imagine yourself sitting in front of Jesus when these words were spoken. And you have been taught all along, if someone hits you, you have the right to hit them back. And in fact, you're encouraged to retaliate. Imagine having that as your background and hearing Jesus say, if someone strikes you on the cheek, oh, yeah, I can hit them back. That's what you're thinking. That's what you expect. Instead, you hear, offer your other cheek also. What? Jesus, wait a minute. Hey, did he just say what I think he said? That's kind of what I imagine was going on. People kind of looking at each other going, what kind of teaching is this? Why would I waive my right to retaliate? It is my right. When I am punched, when I am insulted, it is my right to retaliate. That's what we have been taught. But Jesus says, I tell you, turn or offer the other cheek also. Maybe this is something that you have noticed before, but Jesus says, when someone strikes your right cheek, offer the other also. Before, just in passing, I figure, someone slaps you, okay, and just kind of turn the other cheek. That's kind of what I imagined. But when you really read through this passage carefully, there's one detail that I think most of us don't kind of slow down to take a look at. When someone slaps you on what cheek, Jesus says? What side, left or right? Right side. It's 50-50, right? So when someone slaps you on the right cheek, your right cheek, offer the other also. And we have to stop and just look at that word, right cheek. Okay? Imagine yourself coming up to me. Okay, maybe not to me, but imagine yourself standing in front of somebody and you're going to slap the right cheek. Okay, imagine how you're going to do that. Okay, there's really only two ways. One is to use your left hand, right? Because the right cheek will be on this side. You would hit them left-handed. Now, there are some people who are left-handed in our world, right? But most of the time, we're right-handed. I never slap left-handed. Never. If I slap or I strike, I'm right-handed, so my right hand is going to come out first. So if you're not using your left hand to strike someone's right cheek, then which hand are you using? Well, you have your other hand. But people don't slap like this. What do they do? If you're going to slap someone's right cheek, you're going to backhand, right? You're going to use the back of your hand to slap the person. Just think about that for a moment. A backhanded slap is so disrespectful, isn't it? Slapping this way versus this way with the palm is very different. Getting slapped is bad enough. But to be slapped backhanded, that's even worse. Usually what happens is the person that strikes with the back of the palm, usually we see this in a dynamic of perhaps a slave master to a slave, someone that's in authority to someone that's maybe lower than them. That is kind of the way that we see. Jesus says, look, if you find yourself in a situation where you're slapped on your right cheek, offer the other cheek also. Do not retaliate. One of the scholars, as he's looking at this passage, he looked at the Jewish law and he found this. The backhanded stroke, he said, was a very insulting stroke, a very offensive one. When you check the Jewish law, you will see that if you slap a person with the palm of your hand, you will be fined 200 zuzims. I'm not sure what the equivalent of that is. But if you slap a person with the back of your hand, you will be fined 400. That means to say that the backhanded slap was regarded as a double insult. An insult worthy of double fine. So under the Jewish law, to slap a person is considered as a great insult because by doing so, you have humiliated that person. But by slapping him with the back of your hand, you have inflicted double damage upon him. When you get slapped on your right cheek by a backhanded stroke, not many of us would be able to turn the other cheek. Because we know, especially in certain cultures, that backhanded slap is a sign of tremendous disrespect. They're saying, I am above you. That's the message. That's the spirit in which that strike comes. It is a very insulting strike. So that's the context in which Jesus says, offer the other cheek. Very challenging. Think for a moment how you would respond if you were hit that way, backhanded, across your right cheek. Immediately, your right fist will fly forward to that person. It's just natural. You get slapped, Jesus says, hey, right here too. What that means is not only you get back-fisted, but he's saying offer so that they can come back around and hit you. Offer the other cheek. Instead of retaliation, Jesus says, offer the other cheek. And the New Living Translation says, offer the other cheek. I love that better than turn the other cheek of the NIV translation. It sends a different meaning. Not just turn it, but say, you know what? Offer it. That means that you are willingly saying, I'm not going to retaliate. Offer that cheek. Instead of striking the person back, as you have heard or as you have been taught, an eye for an eye, Jesus says, do nothing. Turn the other cheek. Turning the other cheek means not to return insult with insult, which is what most people expect. When we respond in a manner that is unnatural, because once again, in Jesus' time, the Pharisees, the religious leaders of the time were teaching, retaliate. You get struck, strike back. You get insulted, insult them back. Because an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. That was the teaching of the religious leaders. And to that, Jesus says, actually, you know what? You know what is better? Turn the other cheek. This was an upside down teaching. If you look at the Sermon on the Mount, everything that Jesus teaches, it's incredible. The people sitting there must have been going, what kind of teaching is this? How would I even imagine resisting the temptation and the urge to retaliate? When we respond in a manner that is unnatural, offering the other cheek is an unnatural response. What it does is it displays the supernatural indwelling power of the Holy Spirit that is within us. Because I don't know about you guys, but it would take every ounce of strength in my body not to retaliate. I used to get into a few fights in, junior high school, because somebody insulted me. I was like, oh, no, you didn't, right? And then it's on. Growing up in Portland, when I was in junior high school 20-something years ago, it wasn't as diverse as it is today. When I went to my first elementary school, second grade, me and my two sisters and my two cousins, 5 of us were the only Asians in the entire school. Everybody else was white. We went to school in Aloha. That's kind of the world that we moved into. Nowadays, Timothy's going to start kindergarten next year. We went to a kindergarten orientation. I think the minorities were almost equal to the Caucasian population or the students potentially. Times have changed a lot. And I used to get made fun of a lot. I remember one time, I think it was in 7th grade. This guy, we were playing, PE class, you were playing or something. Some guy said something to me. He goes, "Oh, you chink." I got so mad. And I looked right at my teacher. He was the football coach of the school as well. He looked at me, he goes, he turned his back. And I went up to him, I said, "What did you say?" He's like, "Oh, no, I'm sorry." And people are like, "Kick his butt." Oh, if that teacher did that today, he would get fired, right? But there was a different time back then. I used to get like racial slurs thrown at me, and that used to boil me. But Jesus teaches what? In that moment, he says, don't retaliate. Imagine hearing that. When everything up to this point, when everyone says, you have the right to retaliate, Jesus says, you know what would be better? Don't retaliate. So when we respond in a manner that is unnatural, when his followers, when the disciples of Jesus, when we respond in a manner that is unnatural, that is countercultural, it displays the supernatural power of the indwelling Holy Spirit. It shows, okay, something is different about this person. I just insulted them, I just struck them, and he's saying, hit my other side. That's just weird. When we see Jesus making this statement now in Matthew chapter 5, and at the end, what's going to happen as he's being accused and on trial? He also does not retaliate before those who falsely accuse him as he goes to the cross. Responding to hatred with love just might grab someone's attention. And we've seen powerful stories of this. Forgiveness is a tough thing. We want to hold a grudge. We want to hold a grudge because it's something that is so powerful. When I do premarital counseling to couples who are engaged, about to get married, one of the things that we cover in the session is don't hold a grudge. Because in 1 Corinthians, one of the things Paul says is love keeps no record of wrongs. But we love to keep record of wrongs. We love to hold grudges because we use that. And couples, we use this as a weapon later on. Hey, remember when you did this to me? Oh, I thought you were not going to bring that up. Well, just remember. It's like, why do we do that? What Paul is saying is before you go to bed, wipe the slate clean. Don't hold a grudge, but we love to do that. Revenge is like holding a grudge. And you look for the time when you will unleash. And you never get even. We always want to kind of up. And then that person goes, well, I'm going to give. And then it goes up. And it just escalates. I see that among my kids all the time. Timothy does something to Abby, or Abby does something to Timothy. Usually, Abby does something to Timothy. He retaliates, and she retaliates, and before you know it, they're crying on the floor because they got punched, or they punched, they kick, they break something, they scream or yell, something. I see the escalation multiple times a day. Probably already a couple times today. They might be doing that upstairs right now. I don't know. But that we see this happening. Boom, it just builds and builds and builds. And Jesus says, why are you acting this way? He said, do nothing. Don't retaliate. I read a blog post this week that said this. You can understand that this principle of eye for an eye can easily be misunderstood and misapplied if we don't know why we should waive our rights. It sounds so unnatural, so contrary to our common sense. In this day and age, it is much more reasonable to talk about having your rights being respected. So why would I waive my rights? Because in this attitude, we find the whole essence of forgiveness. That's what forgiveness is all about. To waive your rights is to forgive the other person. If somebody steps on my shoe, I have the right to demand that he polishes it. But the spiritual man does not stand on his right. He gives it away. That's okay. I forgive you. And he forgives because he has experienced genuine forgiveness. If God stood on his right, we would all be finished. Do you realize that? If God is to stand on his right because we have insulted his divine nature, because we have lived a life that is so far from his way or his law, because we have not given him the glory that is his due, if God stands on his right, none of us will be here today. You see, this idea of forgiveness is not just simply we forgive. We forgive to the degree that we have been forgiven. I don't know how old you guys are, but for me, I'm just advancing every year. It goes quicker and quicker and quicker. The older you get, the greater, I think, your transgressions. It's just that way. You have greater chance to make mistakes, greater opportunities. Me, today versus 30 years ago, I have much more to be forgiven for today than in the past. Why? Because over the last 30 years, I have accumulated a lot of debt, so to speak. So to the degree that you and I have been forgiven, that is how we are to forgive. Because we have been forgiven, we are called to forgive. It's not independent of that. If it was independent of that, you and I would not be able to do it. God says forgive because you have been forgiven much. Though revenge may be sweet and satisfying, Jesus calls his disciples, don't escalate the situation by getting even. Rather, he says, de-escalate. Lower the stakes by offering the other cheek. Once again, someone comes to you and slaps you. If you retaliate, it escalates the situation. Jesus' teaching is de-escalate. He's basically saying, forgive. Do not take revenge. No matter what insult is heaped on you, waive your right to retaliate. And the basis of that is because you have been forgiven. Therefore, you ought to forgive. Offer the other cheek. Jesus calls us to respond counterintuitively. Instead of meeting evil with equal or greater force, he urges us to meet evil with a completely different force, with good. They did the wrong thing. Jesus says, you do the right thing. Offer the other cheek.